The Vampire King whispered those 4 words, and the entire courtroom froze. Elizabeth Miller touched her stomach instinctively, but carrying his heir meant becoming a target for every rival faction, and the protection he promised came with a price that would change her forever. The ancient stone walls of the Vampire High Court seemed to pulse with a life of their own, as Elizabeth Miller felt the weight of 1,000 immortal gazes pressing down upon her. The obsidian throne room stretched impossibly high above her head, its vaulted ceiling disappearing into shadows that had witnessed centuries of blood and politics. Vampire King Robert Sterling stood before his ornate chair of power, his pale hands still trembling from the words that had just escaped his lips. The silence that followed his declaration felt like the moment before lightning strikes, electric and dangerous and full of promise that everything was about to change forever. Elizabeth's fingers found her stomach without conscious thought, pressing against the slight curve beneath her simple black dress. The fabric felt suddenly too thin, too revealing, as if every vampire in the room could see through to the impossible life growing within her. Mr. Thompson's silver eyes narrowed to slits from his position near the eastern wall, his ancient face carved from marble and malice. Miss Jenkins's crimson lips curved into something that might have been a smile, if smiles could draw blood. The other nobles shifted like predators, scenting weakness, their silk robes rustling with the sound of autumn leaves before a storm. Elizabeth had walked into this courtroom 3 hours ago as a legal advocate representing human interests in supernatural law. She had prepared arguments about territory disputes and feeding regulations. She had not prepared for the Vampire King to look directly into her eyes and announce to his entire court that she carried his child. The baby kicked as if responding to the tension in the room, and Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat. Now, please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It's always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. She had discovered the pregnancy only 2 weeks ago, had been wrestling with impossible questions about paternity and timing, and the single night 3 months past, when grief and loneliness and too much wine had led her to Robert's private chambers. That night felt like a dream now. Soft and hazy and touched with magic. She couldn't quite believe. This moment felt like waking up to find the dream had teeth. Robert stepped down from his throne with fluid grace that reminded Elizabeth why humans had once worshipped beings like him as gods. His dark hair fell across his forehead as he moved, and his eyes held that same intensity that had drawn her to him in the first place. He was beautiful in the way that dangerous things were beautiful, like storm clouds or deep water or the edge of a blade catching moonlight. But there was something else in his expression now, something protective and fierce that made her pulse quicken despite the circumstances. The Vampire King raised his hand, and the whispered chaos of the court died instantly. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of 5 centuries of rule and the quiet desperation of a man who had just gambled everything on a single moment. "Elizabeth," he said, and her name sounded different in his mouth than it ever had before. She felt her legs move without her permission, drawn by compulsion or instinct or simple terror. The marble floor was cold beneath her feet, even through her shoes, and she could smell the ancient incense that burned eternally in the braziers flanking the throne. Each step brought her closer to Robert and further from any hope of pretending this wasn't happening. The vampire lords and ladies watched her approach with expressions ranging from curiosity to hunger to barely concealed rage. Some of them had been alive when ancient civilizations fell. Others had walked through plague years and world wars and the slow, careful emergence of vampires from shadow into reluctant coexistence with humanity. All of them understood that the woman walking toward their king carried more than just a child. She carried the future of their species, and futures were dangerous things when you had lived as long as they had. When Elizabeth reached the base of the throne, Robert descended the final steps until they stood face to face. She could see gold flecks in his dark eyes and smell the faint metallic scent that clung to all vampires like a signature. His skin was pale as moonlight and twice as cold when he reached out to touch her cheek. The gesture should have been gentle, but Elizabeth felt the barely restrained power in his fingers and knew that he could snap her neck without conscious effort. Instead, he traced the line of her jaw with something approaching reverence. The court held its collective breath as Robert withdrew a ceremonial dagger from his belt. The blade was older than any nation currently existing on Earth, forged in fires that had been allowed to die out before Christianity reached Rome. Its edge gleamed with the kind of sharpness that came from centuries of use and careful maintenance. Elizabeth's heart hammered against her ribs as she realized what was about to happen. But there was nowhere to run, and no way to stop the momentum of ancient law and older magic. His voice echoed off the stone walls and settled into the bones of everyone present. The blade bit into his palm with surgical precision, releasing blood so dark it looked black in the torchlight. Elizabeth watched in fascination and horror as the wound healed almost instantly, leaving only the crimson evidence pulled in his cupped hand. She knew she should pull away when he reached for her forehead, should protest or negotiate or demand explanations. Instead, she stood frozen as his bloodied thumb traced a symbol between her eyebrows. The mark burned like ice fire, sinking through skin and bone and settling somewhere deeper than anatomy had names for. Power flowed between them, alien and overwhelming and strangely comforting. Elizabeth gasped as the connection snapped into place, binding her to Robert with chains made of magic and law and something that felt suspiciously like destiny. She could feel his emotions now, the complex mixture of relief and fear and possessive protection that drove his actions. Beneath that lay deeper currents, loneliness so profound it had its own gravity, and hope so fragile it made her chest tight with sympathy. The Vampire King had just claimed her as his own in front of the most powerful supernatural beings in the Western Hemisphere, and what shocked Elizabeth most was how right it felt. The assembled court shifted and murmured as the bloodmark completed its work. Ms. Jenkins' eyes glittered with something between admiration and calculation. Mr. Thompson's jaw clenched with barely suppressed fury. The younger nobles exchanged glances heavy with implication and opportunity. Elizabeth realized that Robert's protection came with a price she was only beginning to understand. She was safe from direct harm now, protected by laws older than recorded history. But she was also claimed property, bound to the Vampire King by ties that death itself might not sever. The child growing inside her was no longer just her baby. It belonged to House Sterling, to the vampire nobility, to a world of politics and power that operated by rules she couldn't hope to comprehend. As the formal ceremony concluded and the court began to disperse, Elizabeth caught sight of her reflection in one of the polished obsidian pillars. The blood mark on her forehead had faded to invisibility, but she could still feel its presence like a brand. Her dark hair hung loose around her shoulders, and her brown eyes held a new weariness that made her look older than her 32 years. She looked like a woman who had just discovered that the world was far stranger and more dangerous than she had ever imagined. Robert's hands settled on her lower back, guiding her toward a side exit that would take them away from the main corridors where curious vampires might linger. His touch was possessive but gentle, and Elizabeth found herself leaning into the solid warmth of his presence. The pregnancy had left her constantly tired and occasionally nauseous, but there was something about being near Robert that made her feel stronger. Perhaps it was the blood bond, or perhaps it was simply the relief of no longer facing the unknown alone. They walked in silence through passages carved from living rock, past tapestries that depicted vampire history in threads of silver and gold and dried blood. Elizabeth's mind raced with questions she didn't know how to ask. What did this protection really mean? What would happen to her freedom, her career, her life? What kind of world was she bringing a child into? But beneath the practical concerns lay a deeper uncertainty. The night she had spent with Robert had felt like stepping outside of time, a moment of connection so intense it had left her shaken for days afterward. She had told herself it was grief-fueled madness, a reaction to losing her mentor in a supernatural attack that had destroyed her faith in the safety of the human world. She had tried to forget the way he had looked at her, like she was something precious and rare, the way his careful control had cracked just enough to let her see the lonely man beneath the crown. Now she wondered if forgetting had ever been possible, or if this moment had been inevitable from the instant their eyes first met across a conference room 6 months ago. The Vampire King glanced down at her as they walked, and Elizabeth caught a glimpse of uncertainty in his ancient eyes. He had just upended centuries of vampire lore and tradition by publicly claiming a human woman carrying his child. The political ramifications would be felt for decades, assuming they both survived the immediate fallout. But there was something in his expression that suggested politics were the least of his concerns. He looked like a man who had just revealed his greatest weakness to his worst enemies, and who would do it again in a heartbeat if it meant protecting what he loved. Elizabeth's hand found her stomach again, and she felt the flutter of movement that still amazed her every time. The baby was real, growing stronger every day, blissfully unaware that it had just become the most important child in supernatural history. Whatever came next, whatever prices they would all have to pay, there was no going back now. The Vampire King had spoken his truth to the world, and the world would never be the same. The mountain road twisted through pine forests so dense that sunlight barely penetrated the canopy, and Elizabeth pressed her face against the bulletproof glass of Robert's armored car as they climbed higher into terrain that maps forgot to mention. The vehicle moved with supernatural smoothness despite the rough terrain, its engine purring with the kind of engineering that money couldn't buy and governments didn't know existed. Robert sat beside her in silence, his attention focused on reports that arrived on his phone in languages Elizabeth couldn't identify, but his free hand rested on her knee with a possessiveness that was becoming familiar. The blood bond hummed between them, like a low-frequency vibration she felt in her bones, carrying echoes of his emotions that made it impossible to ignore how tightly controlled his worry had become. When Stirling Manor finally emerged from the mist ahead of them, Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat, despite everything she thought she knew about vampire wealth and power. The fortress rose from the mountainside like it had grown there naturally, its Gothic spires and flying buttresses carved from the same dark stone as the cliffs beneath it. Towers reached toward the sky with windows that glowed like eyes in the gathering dusk, and Elizabeth could see the subtle shimmer of protective wards layered over the entire structure like heat waves in reverse. The place felt ancient in a way that made her skin prickle, old enough to have witnessed the rise and fall of empires, and patient enough to outlast whatever came next. Guards appeared from hidden positions as their car approached the main gate, moving with fluid precision that marked them as vampires rather than human security. They wore modern tactical gear over bodies that had been honed by centuries of combat, and their eyes tracked Elizabeth's movements with the intensity of predators evaluating potential prey. The massive iron gate swung open without sound, revealing a courtyard paved with stones that had been worn smooth by countless feet over countless years. Elizabeth felt like she was entering a world that operated by different rules than the one she had known, where power was measured in blood and time rather than money and influence. Robert escorted her through corridors that stretched further than any building had a right to, past suits of armor that had seen real battle, and portraits of vampire nobility whose eyes seemed to follow their movement. The walls were lined with tapestries depicting scenes from supernatural history, moments of triumph and tragedy rendered in threads that glowed with their own inner light. Elizabeth's footsteps echoed despite the thick carpets, and she noticed how the sound seemed to carry information to listeners she couldn't see, announcing her presence to the castle's residents like a dinner bell calling predators to feed. Her quarters occupied an entire wing of the castle's eastern tower, with rooms that flowed seamlessly from one to another, like a luxury hotel suite designed by someone who had never heard of budgets or building codes. The bedroom featured a four-poster bed, large enough to sleep a small army draped in silk that felt like liquid moonlight against her fingers. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of the valley below that would have taken her breath away under different circumstances. But the beauty couldn't disguise the fact that the windows didn't open and the glass was thick enough to stop bullets. The sitting room contained furniture that belonged in museums, pieces crafted by artisans whose names had been lost to history, but whose skill lived on in wood and metal and stone that seemed to glow with inner warmth. A library filled one wall with books in languages both familiar and impossible, their leather bindings showing the careful maintenance of centuries. Elizabeth touched the spine of one volume and felt a shock of recognition, though she couldn't read the symbols that decorated its cover. Everything was beautiful and expensive and designed to keep her comfortable while she remained exactly where Robert wanted her to be. The realization that she was a prisoner hit her like cold water, despite the luxury surrounding her. The door locked from the outside, though she discovered this when she tried to explore the castle's hallways and found herself gently but firmly turned back by guards who appeared from nowhere with apologetic smiles and immovable determination. Her phone had no signal despite the powerful antenna she could see on the castle's highest tower, and the internet connection required passwords she didn't possess and permissions she hadn't been granted. She was safe, protected, and completely isolated from the world she had known just hours before. When Robert appeared at her door that evening, he brought with him a woman who introduced herself as Dr. Miller, with a voice that carried traces of accents from different centuries. She was tall and elegant, with skin that seemed to shift between human warmth and vampire power, depending on the angle of the light, and her eyes held knowledge that felt older than her apparent age. Elizabeth recognized the signs immediately from her legal work with supernatural clients. Dr. Miller was a hybrid, one of the rare individuals born from vampire and human parents, existing in the space between worlds with all the advantages and disadvantages that entailed. The doctor's examination was thorough and surprisingly gentle, her touch clinical but understanding as she measured Elizabeth's vital signs and took blood samples with equipment that looked like it belonged in a science fiction movie. The baby's heartbeat filled the room through speakers that translated sound into something beyond human hearing range, strong and steady and impossibly fast. Dr. Miller's expression grew more curious as she worked, making notes in a language Elizabeth couldn't identify, while muttering observations that sounded like they belonged in academic papers rather than medical consultations. "Your body is adapting faster than expected," Dr. Miller explained as she reviewed the results, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone delivering news that could be either wonderful or terrible, depending on perspective. "The child is accelerating changes that normally take decades to manifest in vampire-human relationships." Elizabeth felt her heart skip as the implications sank in. She had expected some changes during pregnancy, the normal adaptations that came with carrying any child, but this sounded like something far more fundamental. Dr. Miller's scanner showed cellular modifications happening at the genetic level, alterations that were strengthening muscle tissue and reinforcing bone density, while introducing new neural pathways that seemed designed for enhanced sensory processing. The vampire child wasn't just growing inside her. It was remaking her from the inside out, transforming her into something that could survive in both worlds. Robert watched the examination with an intensity that made Elizabeth's skin warm, despite the clinical setting, his emotions bleeding through their bond in waves of protective concern and carefully controlled hope. When Dr. Miller finished her work and departed with promises to return for daily monitoring, he settled into the chair beside Elizabeth's bed with movements that spoke of exhaustion deeper than physical tiredness. The Vampire King had been beautiful in the courtroom, commanding and powerful and seemingly invincible. But here, in the soft lamplight of her bedroom, he looked like a man carrying the weight of impossible choices on shoulders that had already borne too much. Elizabeth studied his profile as he stared out at the darkening sky, noting the sharp line of his jaw and the way shadows gathered in the hollows beneath his eyes like bruises made of time itself. The silence stretched between them until she couldn't bear it anymore, and her questions spilled out like water through a broken dam. Why haven't vampire children been born in 2 centuries? What curse could be powerful enough to affect an entire species? What did it mean that their child might be different, might be special, might be the key to changes that neither of them could fully understand? Robert's answers came slowly, drawn from him like confessions under torture. The curse had been laid by a dying witch, whose family had been slaughtered by vampire nobility during the wars that followed the species' emergence from hiding. A piece of magic so deep and fundamental that it had woven itself into the very fabric of vampire reproduction. Children could still be conceived, but they died before birth, taking their mothers with them in a spiral of failure that had nearly driven vampires to extinction through despair alone. Only true love between vampire and human could break the curse for a single child. But the cost was always the mother's humanity, transforming her into something new or killing her in the process. Elizabeth pressed her hand to her stomach and felt the baby respond with a flutter of movement that seemed almost reassuring, as if the tiny life inside her was aware of the conversation and determined to prove all the dire predictions wrong. But Robert's expression told her that hope was a luxury they couldn't afford, that too many powerful forces had too much invested in the current state of supernatural politics to allow their child to survive if it truly represented the change the old prophecies described. While Elizabeth absorbed the magnitude of her situation in the safety of Stirling Manor, the forces arrayed against them were already beginning to move like chess pieces across a board that stretched from the highest levels of vampire nobility to the deepest chambers of human government. Miss Jenkins paced the marble floors of her estate with feline grace, her crimson dress flowing around her like liquid fire as she spoke in rapid French to contacts across 3 continents. The vampire lady had survived 5 centuries by understanding that change was opportunity for those brave enough to seize it. And Elizabeth's pregnancy represented the kind of upheaval that could reshape the entire supernatural world if properly exploited. She had already begun reaching out to younger vampire nobles who chafed under Robert's traditional leadership, promising them power and territory in exchange for support when the time came to act. Miss Jenkins understood better than most that a half-vampire child would be either the bridge that united their species with humanity or the weapon that destroyed both sides. And she intended to be the one who controlled which outcome came to pass. Mr. Thompson's approach was more direct, but no less dangerous. His pale hands moving across maps that showed vampire territories throughout the Americas, while his advisors provided updates on military assets that officially didn't exist. The elder vampire lord commanded loyalty through fear rather than politics, ruling his domain with the kind of iron discipline that had served him well during the darker periods of vampire history. He saw Elizabeth's pregnancy as an abomination that threatened the purity of their bloodlines and the careful balance of power that kept vampire society stable. And his solution was characteristically simple: kill the woman, kill the child, and eliminate the problem before it could spread to other couples who might be inspired by Robert's example. Mr. Thompson had already begun mobilizing resources for a direct assault on Stirling Manor, gathering mercenaries and weapons that could breach even Robert's formidable defenses if applied with sufficient force and cunning. In the human world, Detective Michael Davis stared at Elizabeth's empty apartment with the growing certainty that her disappearance was connected to the supernatural cases they had worked together for the past 3 years. Detective Davis had been Elizabeth's partner in developing legal frameworks for vampire-human cooperation, watching her navigate the complex politics of species relations with a skill that had earned respect on both sides of the divide. Her sudden absence felt wrong in ways that his investigative instincts couldn't ignore, especially when combined with reports of unusual activity around known vampire gathering places and the mysterious cancellation of several high-level supernatural diplomatic meetings. Detective Davis's requests for information through official channels had been met with bureaucratic stonewalling that suggested government agencies he wasn't authorized to know about had already classified Elizabeth's situation as a matter of national security. Elizabeth herself remained unaware of the gathering storm as she explored the boundaries of her luxurious prison, testing the limits of Robert's protection while coming to terms with the changes happening inside her body. The morning after Dr. Miller's examination, she woke feeling stronger than she had in weeks. Her usual pregnancy fatigue replaced by energy that seemed to hum in her veins like electricity. When she rose from bed, her movements felt different, more fluid and controlled than they had been the day before, as if her body was learning new ways to exist in space. The bathroom mirror reflected changes that were subtle but undeniable. Her skin had acquired a luminous quality that made it seem lit from within, and her eyes held flecks of gold that hadn't been there before the blood bond ceremony. Elizabeth tested her new strength by moving furniture that should have required help, lifting chairs and tables with ease that defied her petite frame. In advancing pregnancy, the changes weren't just physical, she realized, as she paid attention to sensory input that felt enhanced beyond normal human parameters. She could hear conversations happening floors below her room, could smell the individual scent of different vampires as they moved through the castle's corridors, could feel vibrations in the stone walls that spoke of hidden passages and secret chambers. When she tried to leave her wing of the castle, the guards who appeared to redirect her moved with speed that would have been blurred to human vision. But Elizabeth found herself tracking their movements with perfect clarity, understanding their positioning and anticipating their actions with instincts she had never possessed before. Her attempt to reach the castle's main entrance was thwarted, not by force, but by a growing sensitivity to sunlight that made her skin burn and her eyes water when she approached the windows that faced east. The vampire child was indeed changing her, transforming her into something that could survive in Robert's world, but might not be able to return to her own. The forest surrounding Stirling Manor stretched for miles in every direction, its ancient pines forming a natural barrier that had protected vampire secrets for centuries. But Elizabeth discovered that her enhanced senses could navigate the twisted paths with an intuition that felt borrowed from predators who had hunted these woods long before human civilization reached the mountains. Her escape attempt began at dawn, when the castle's vampire inhabitants retreated to their day chambers, leaving only human servants and a skeleton crew of guards who assumed the pregnant woman in the eastern tower was safely contained by locked doors and supernatural exhaustion. Elizabeth had spent 3 days memorizing guard rotations and studying the castle's layout through windows that offered glimpses of exterior architecture. Noting the way morning mist clung to certain sections of the outer walls, and how shadows fell across paths that led down the mountainside toward what might be freedom or might be death in the wilderness beyond. The blood bond with Robert pulsed against her consciousness like a compass needle pointing toward his sleeping form somewhere in the castle's depths. But she forced herself to ignore the pull of connection that urged her to return to safety and protection, and the gilded cage that had become her world. Her pregnancy had progressed enough that running was difficult, but her new vampire-enhanced strength compensated for the awkwardness of her changing body, allowing her to climb down from her tower window using handholds carved into stone that no normal human could have reached or trusted to support their weight. The forest floor beneath the castle walls was carpeted with centuries of fallen pine needles that muffled her footsteps as she moved deeper into trees that seemed to whisper warnings in languages older than recorded history. But Elizabeth pressed forward, driven by a desperation that had been building since the moment she realized that Robert's protection came with chains she might never be able to break. She had gone perhaps a mile when the arrow appeared in the tree trunk beside her head, its steel point buried so deep in ancient wood that the shaft vibrated with the force of impact, and its fletching was still smoking from the speed of its flight. Elizabeth spun toward the source of the shot and found herself facing a man who emerged from the forest shadows like he had been carved from darkness itself, his crossbow already reloaded and aimed at her heart with the steady precision of someone who had never missed a target that mattered. David Miller moved with the controlled grace of a predator who had spent years hunting creatures faster and stronger than himself. His tall frame dressed in black tactical gear that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and his pale eyes held the kind of cold calculation that came from staring death in the face so often that it had become an old acquaintance rather than a feared enemy. Elizabeth's enhanced senses told her things about this stranger that her human mind struggled to process, reading the scent of silver and holy water and old blood that clung to his weapons, feeling the electromagnetic signature of devices designed to detect and neutralize supernatural abilities, recognizing the careful way he positioned himself to account for vampire speed and strength. Even though she was obviously pregnant and apparently helpless, David Miller was a vampire hunter, she realized, with a clarity that cut through her panic like ice water, one of the legendary figures that vampires whispered about in their private moments when they thought no humans were listening. And she was standing in front of him with vampire modifications flowing through her bloodstream and a half-vampire child growing in her womb. The crossbow never wavered as David studied her with professional interest, taking in details that would help him determine whether she was victim or accomplice in whatever supernatural conspiracy had brought her to his attention. "Elizabeth Miller," he said, in a voice that carried traces of an accent she couldn't identify but somehow knew, "belonged to places where old wars had been fought with stakes and silver and prayers that might or might not be answered by gods who had grown tired of watching monsters feed on innocence. I know who you are and what you're carrying, and I know that Vampire King has marked you as his property in ways that go deeper than simple possession. The question I need answered is whether you're here by choice or by force, because that determines whether I put this bolt through your heart or offer you something that Robert Sterling never will: freedom." Elizabeth felt the baby kick inside her, as if responding to the threat in the hunter's voice, and her hand moved instinctively to protect her stomach. Even as she tried to process the implications of his words, David Miller knew about her pregnancy, knew about the blood bond, knew enough about vampire politics to understand that her situation was more complex than simple kidnapping or seduction. His offer of freedom hung in the air between them like bait in a trap she couldn't quite see the edges of. But the alternative was returning to a castle, where her choices were being made by others, and her future was being decided by forces beyond her control. She asked, and her voice sounded stronger than she felt, as vampire-enhanced hearing picked up the subtle sounds of the forest around them, the rustle of small creatures fleeing from predators they could sense but not see, the distant crack of branches under the weight of something large moving through the trees with purpose that felt aimed in their direction. David lowered his crossbow slightly, but kept it ready as he explained his proposition with the matter-of-fact tone of someone discussing a business transaction rather than life-and-death choices. The vampire hierarchy was an infection that had been allowed to spread unchecked for too long, he told her. A system of predators who maintained their power by controlling information and eliminating threats before they could grow into real challenges to the established order. Elizabeth's pregnancy represented the kind of change that could upset centuries of careful balance, which made her valuable to anyone who wanted to see the current system destroyed and rebuilt according to different principles. He could get her away from Robert's influence, could provide protection that didn't come with ownership, could ensure that her child grew up free from the political games that had already marked it as either savior or target before its first breath. All he needed in return was her cooperation in bringing down the network of vampire nobles who had committed crimes against humanity that no court would ever prosecute and no government agency would ever investigate. Elizabeth found herself torn between the promise of escape and the growing awareness that her connection to Robert was deeper than simple blood magic or pregnancy hormones. Through their bond, she could feel him beginning to wake as the sun moved past its zenith, could sense his immediate alarm when he discovered her absence and the wave of protective fury that followed like thunder after lightning. Part of her wanted to run toward the freedom David offered to reclaim the independence she had lost when she walked into that vampire courtroom. But another part recognized that cutting the bond between herself and Robert would be like severing an artery that had become essential to her survival. The conversation was interrupted by movement in the trees above them, shadows detaching from branches with liquid grace that marked them as vampires moving at full speed through terrain. They knew better than any human hunter could hope to learn. David's crossbow snapped up toward the canopy as Elizabeth realized that her escape attempt had triggered alarms she hadn't known existed, that Robert's protective instincts had reached through their bond to mobilize guards who were already converging on their position with lethal intent. Robert himself appeared ahead of them, like a force of nature given physical form, his dark hair streaming behind him as he moved between trees with speed that made him seem to teleport rather than run. And his eyes held the kind of cold rage that had once made humans worship vampire kind as terrible gods to be appeased with sacrifice and prayer. David raised his crossbow, but Elizabeth stepped between them before he could fire, her enhanced reflexes surprising her as much as anyone else when she moved fast enough to intercept a shot aimed at the vampire king's heart. The tableau that followed felt frozen in time. Hunter and vampire and pregnant woman caught in a moment where any movement might trigger violence that would end with death for all of them. But Elizabeth could feel through her bond with Robert that his fury was wrapped around terror at the thought of losing her and the child to circumstances beyond his control. "Stand down, Miller," Robert commanded in a voice that carried 5 centuries of absolute authority, his attention focused on the hunter with the intensity of a predator, evaluating prey that had proven more dangerous than expected. "The woman is under my protection, and anyone who threatens her answers to me personally." David kept his weapon trained on the Vampire King, but Elizabeth could see calculation in his expression as he weighed odds that were shifting faster than he could adapt to changing circumstances. She realized that this confrontation was about more than her escape attempt. that forces larger than any of them had been set in motion by her pregnancy, and that every choice they made from this moment forward would have consequences that reached far beyond personal survival. The standoff ended when Elizabeth made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself, choosing to step closer to Robert while keeping her eyes on David Miller as she spoke with conviction that came from somewhere deeper than conscious thought. "I appreciate the offer of freedom, but I need to understand what I'm choosing between before I make decisions that affect my child's future. If you want my cooperation against vampire corruption, prove that your methods won't just replace one form of tyranny with another." David Miller studied her for a long moment before slowly lowering his crossbow, and Elizabeth could see respect in his expression as he recognized that she was choosing to gather information rather than simply accepting the first alternative offered to her situation. "Very well," he said as vampire guards began to emerge from the forest around them with weapons drawn and expressions that promised death to anyone who threatened their king's mate. "But remember that offers of freedom don't remain open indefinitely, and the longer you wait to choose, the fewer options you'll have when circumstances force your hand." Elizabeth felt Robert's relief flood through their bond as David Miller melted back into the forest with the professional skill of someone who had survived countless encounters with supernatural predators. But she also sensed that this meeting had changed something fundamental about their situation in ways that none of them fully understood yet. Back at Stirling Manor, Robert led her to his private chambers for the first time since the night their child was conceived, and Elizabeth found herself in rooms that reflected centuries of accumulated wealth and power, but also profound loneliness that spoke to the isolation of immortal existence. He poured himself wine that smelled of blood and herbs, while she settled into a chair that probably cost more than most people earned in a year, and the silence between them stretched until she finally asked the questions that had been building since her conversation with Dr. Miller and her encounter with the vampire hunter. Robert's answers came reluctantly, drawn from him like confessions that he had never intended to make to anyone, especially not to a human woman whose mortality made her presence in his life feel like holding fire in his bare hands. The curse that prevented vampire reproduction was indeed tied to love, he explained, woven into their species biology by magic that recognized the difference between simple desire and the kind of connection that could bridge the gap between mortal and immortal existence. Their child represented either the key to breaking the curse entirely or the mechanism that would make it permanent, and the outcome depended on factors that neither prophecy nor science could predict with certainty. But there was another curse, older and more personal, that had shaped every relationship Robert had attempted over his 5 centuries of existence. Everyone he allowed himself to love died, usually in ways that could be traced back to his enemies, using his emotions as weapons against him. And Elizabeth's pregnancy had already painted a target on her back that would only grow brighter as the child developed abilities that marked it as either humanity's salvation or its destruction. Elizabeth absorbed this revelation while watching emotions play across Robert's face that she was only beginning to understand through their growing bond. Seeing the weight of loss that had accumulated over centuries of watching lovers and friends and allies fall victim to the political games that surrounded vampire nobility like a deadly atmosphere. She realized that his protection wasn't just about claiming her as property, but about trying to break a pattern that had defined his existence for longer than most civilizations had survived, and that her pregnancy represented his first real hope that love might finally prove stronger than the forces that had used it to hurt him for so long. Their conversation was interrupted by alarms that shrieked through Blackwood Manor's ancient halls, followed immediately by the sound of explosions that made the stone walls tremble like they were caught in an earthquake designed by enemies who understood exactly how to breach defenses that had stood against siege for centuries. Lady Sarah's attack began with diversions that drew guards away from critical positions, followed by direct assault teams that moved with coordination that spoke of careful planning and inside knowledge of the manor's layout and defensive capabilities. Jennifer found herself pulled into a safe room deep in the manor's foundations, while vampire warriors prepared to defend their king's stronghold against enemies who had chosen this moment to test whether Michael's protection was stronger than their desire to eliminate the threat his pregnant human mate represented to their established order. The battle that followed revealed both Jennifer's growing abilities and the presence of a traitor within Michael's inner circle, as attacks targeted weak points that should have been known only to the manor's most trusted inhabitants. Jennifer discovered that physical contact with vampires allowed her to read their emotions and surface thoughts with clarity that felt like looking directly into their souls, and this ability made her invaluable for identifying the spy whose information had made the assault possible, even as it marked her as dangerous to anyone whose loyalty wasn't absolute. The ancient library of Blackwood Manor occupied 3 floors of the northwestern tower, its spiral staircases carved from living rock and its walls lined with volumes that chronicled supernatural history from the first vampire awakening to the complex political treaties that governed modern coexistence between species. Jennifer had been drawn to this sanctuary of knowledge by restlessness that came from being protected but not informed, confined but not consulted about decisions that would shape her child's future and her own existence in ways she was only beginning to comprehend. The pregnancy had entered its 7th month with changes that left her feeling like a stranger in her own body. Vampire abilities flowering alongside human intuition in combinations that sometimes overwhelmed her enhanced senses with information she didn't know how to process. Sleep had become elusive as the baby's movements grew stronger and more frequent, accompanied by dreams that felt like memories borrowed from bloodlines she had never possessed, and visions of futures that shifted between paradise and apocalypse, depending on choices she hadn't yet been forced to make. The library silence welcomed her like an old friend as she climbed toward the highest level where the oldest texts were kept under preservation spells that made the air itself feel thick with accumulated wisdom and carefully guarded secrets. Moonlight streamed through stained glass windows that depicted vampire history in scenes of beauty and horror intertwined, casting colored shadows across reading tables that had been polished by centuries of scholarly hands, seeking answers to questions that civilizations preferred not to ask. Jennifer's enhanced night vision allowed her to navigate the narrow aisles between towering bookshelves without artificial illumination, and her developing psychic abilities guided her toward volumes that seemed to pulse with relevance to her situation, even though their leather bindings bore no titles in any language she recognized. The Blood Moon prophecy revealed itself to her, like a secret that had been waiting centuries for the right person to discover it, hidden within a manuscript, bound in material that felt warm to the touch and seemed to glow with its own inner light when she opened its pages. The text was written in multiple languages that flowed from one to another, as if the writer had been too excited to maintain linguistic consistency. But Jennifer found she could read every word with clarity that suggested her vampire-enhanced abilities included linguistic comprehension beyond normal human limitations. The prophecy spoke of a child born when vampire and human love transcended the boundaries that separated mortal from immortal existence, a bridge builder whose very existence would force both species to confront fundamental questions about the nature of life and death, and the space that existed between them. This child would possess abilities that belonged to both worlds and neither, walking in sunlight and shadow with equal ease, commanding powers that could heal the ancient wounds between species or tear them apart completely, depending on the choices made by those who shaped its early development. But the prophecy's most devastating revelation was its description of the price that must be paid for such extraordinary potential, the cosmic balance that demanded sacrifice proportional to the power being granted. The mother of the bridge child must choose between her own continued existence and her offspring's full awakening to its destined abilities. Her life force becoming the foundation upon which the child's power would be built, like a temple constructed from willing sacrifice rather than stolen innocence. Jennifer felt the baby respond to her emotional turmoil with increased movement, as if the tiny life inside her was aware of the conversations happening about its future, and determined to remind everyone involved that it was more than just a prophetic symbol or political game piece. The weight of destiny settled around her shoulders like a cloak made of responsibilities she had never asked for. And she understood with crystalline clarity that Michael had known about this choice from the moment he learned of her pregnancy, had been living with the knowledge that loving her meant potentially losing her to forces beyond anyone's control. The sound of footsteps on the spiral staircase below drew her attention away from the prophecy's implications, and Jennifer felt through her blood bond that Michael was approaching with emotions that mixed relief at finding her with apprehension about what she might have discovered during her midnight research session. She closed the ancient manuscript and returned it to its place among the other volumes before he reached the top floor. But her expression must have revealed that she had learned things he had hoped to keep hidden, because his face went carefully neutral. In the way she had learned meant he was preparing for difficult conversations that could change everything between them. "You've found it," he said without preamble, his voice carrying centuries of weariness as he moved to stand beside the window where moonlight painted silver patterns across the stone floor. Jennifer nodded, because there was no point in pretending ignorance when their bond carried emotional truth between them more clearly than spoken words, and she could feel his guilt and fear and desperate love tangled together in ways that made her heart ache for the impossible position he had been placed in by circumstances neither of them had chosen. The silence stretched between them until she finally asked the question that had to be voiced before it poisoned everything they were building together. "How long have you known that loving you might kill me?" Michael's answer came wrapped in pain that had been accumulating since the night they first made love. Months of carrying knowledge that their growing connection might be built on borrowed time, and that every moment of happiness they shared together brought them closer to a choice that would destroy one of them regardless of which option they selected. He had hoped the prophecy might be wrong, had consulted scholars and seers and ancient texts that might offer alternatives to the stark choice between Jennifer's life and their child's power. But every source confirmed what the original manuscript made clear. The bridge child's abilities were too vast to manifest without a foundation of willing sacrifice from the one who carried it into existence, and no amount of love or determination or magical intervention could change the fundamental laws that governed such profound transformations. Jennifer absorbed this revelation while watching emotions play across Michael's face that spoke to the depth of his internal struggle, seeing how the knowledge had eaten at him like acid while he tried to balance honesty with hope and protection with truth. She realized that his insistence on keeping her safe in the manor wasn't just about external threats, but about buying time to find solutions that might not exist to problems that had been written into the fabric of reality by forces older than recorded history. Part of her was angry at being kept ignorant of something so fundamental to her own survival, but a larger part understood that some burdens were too heavy to share until circumstances forced the conversation into the open, where it could either strengthen their connection or destroy it completely. Their discussion was interrupted by alarms that shrieked through the Manor's communication system with urgency that made Jennifer's enhanced senses recoil from the assault of sound and electromagnetic activity that accompanied emergency protocols designed to coordinate responses to threats that could manifest faster than normal human reflexes could track. Michael's expression shifted instantly from vulnerable lover to commanding king as he processed information flowing through channels Jennifer couldn't access. His centuries of leadership experience taking control of a situation that was developing too quickly for careful analysis or measured responses. The breach had come from within, rather than without, penetrating defenses that should have been impregnable, because someone with access to the Manor's most sensitive security information had provided enemies with exactly the intelligence they needed to strike where resistance would be weakest. Jennifer felt her pregnancy-enhanced intuition, screaming warnings about betrayal and deception even before specific details became clear. Her developing psychic abilities, picking up emotional signatures throughout the Manor that spoke to fear and confusion and the particular kind of guilt that came from knowing that trusted friends had revealed themselves as enemies when survival hung in the balance. Dr. Miller appeared in the library doorway with medical equipment that looked more military than clinical, her hybrid nature allowing her to move through the Manor's corridors without triggering alarms designed to detect pure vampire or human intruders. Jennifer's enhanced senses immediately registered the wrongness in the doctor's emotional signature, picking up layers of deception and calculation that had been carefully hidden beneath professional competence and friendly concern during their previous interactions. The betrayal revealed itself in stages as Dr. Miller explained her true purpose with the matter-of-fact tone of someone who had been planning this moment for months, waiting for the right combination of circumstances to extract Jennifer and her unborn child from Michael's protection for transport to laboratories that existed in classified locations where government scientists were attempting to replicate vampire-human hybrid development through artificial means. Jennifer's pregnancy represented the first natural occurrence of such a phenomenon in over 2 centuries, making her biological data invaluable to researchers who wanted to understand how vampire genetics could be weaponized for military applications or neutralized to eliminate supernatural threats to human dominance. The tranquilizer gun Dr. Miller produced from her medical bag was designed specifically for pregnant women, undergoing rapid supernatural transformation. Its chemical payload, calibrated to sedate Jennifer without harming the developing child, whose genetic material was worth more to certain government agencies than the lives of everyone in Blackwood Manor combined. Jennifer felt the baby respond to her surge of adrenaline and protective fury, with movements that seemed almost coordinated, as if the tiny life inside her was preparing to defend both of them against threats. Its enhanced development allowed it to sense, even from the womb. Michael moved with vampire speed that blurred the boundaries between physics and magic. But Dr. Miller had anticipated his response and triggered devices that filled the air with electromagnetic interference, designed to disrupt the supernatural senses that made vampire reflexes so deadly in close combat. The library became a battlefield where centuries of accumulated knowledge provided both weapons and cover. As Jennifer discovered that her hybrid abilities allowed her to function normally, despite interference that left Michael struggling to coordinate movements that had been second nature for 500 years. Jennifer's first direct contact with Dr. Miller, through her enhanced psychic abilities, revealed the full scope of the betrayal that had been growing like cancer within Michael's inner circle. Months of careful intelligence gathering and relationship building designed to position the hybrid doctor perfectly for the moment when Jennifer's pregnancy reached the stage where extraction would provide maximum scientific value. The government organization behind the operation saw vampire-human hybrids as either weapons to be developed or threats to be eliminated. And they had been systematically identifying and recruiting individuals with access to supernatural communities for operations that existed outside any legal framework or ethical oversight. Dr. Miller's hybrid nature made her perfect for infiltrating vampire society while maintaining loyalty to human agencies that promised her a place in whatever world emerged from the conflict they were engineering between species that had been learning to coexist despite centuries of mutual suspicion and fear. The confrontation ended when Jennifer's desperate attempt to escape Dr. Miller's sedative triggered an explosion of psychic energy that revealed the true extent of her developing abilities. Her mind, touching every consciousness in the manner simultaneously and broadcasting emotions with intensity that left vampires and humans alike temporarily stunned by the force of her protective instincts channeled through supernatural power she was only beginning to understand. The feedback from that mental contact showed her something that changed everything about how she understood her relationship with Michael, revealing through direct emotional connection that his love for her was entirely genuine and had existed independently of pregnancy hormones or blood bond magic or political necessity. She saw herself through his perceptions and felt the depth of connection that had been building between them since their first meeting. The recognition of souls that belonged together despite the impossibility of their circumstances and the forces arrayed against any hope of lasting happiness. Dr. Miller's betrayal had been designed to exploit Jennifer's growing doubts about the authenticity of her feelings for Michael, but instead it provided proof that their emotional bond was the one genuine element in a situation surrounded by manipulation and political calculation from every direction. The Manor's security systems were already compromised beyond repair, and external forces were moving to take advantage of the chaos Dr. Miller's operation had created, leaving Jennifer and Michael with no choice but to abandon the stronghold that had been his base of power for centuries and flee into an uncertain future where protection would have to come from allies they weren't sure they could trust and resources they hadn't yet learned to access. As they prepared for escape through passages that led deep into the mountain's heart, Jennifer felt the baby respond to their shared determination with movements that seemed almost encouraging, as if the prophesied bridge child was already preparing to face whatever challenges awaited them in a world where vampire and human and hybrid interests were converging toward conflicts that would determine the future of all three species. The underground sanctuary revealed itself through a hidden entrance carved into cliffs that overlooked the valley, where human settlements nestled between forests that had sheltered supernatural secrets for generations, its location known only to those who had sworn blood oaths to protect the vulnerable and the hunted, regardless of species or circumstance. Jennifer descended into tunnels that had been carved from living rock by hands both human and vampire working together toward common survival. Their walls lined with phosphorescent minerals that provided gentle illumination without the harsh, artificial lighting that could betray the sanctuary's presence to aerial surveillance or electronic detection equipment. The community that thrived in these hidden chambers represented everything that government agencies and rival vampire factions feared most. Proof that cooperation between species was not only possible, but natural, when survival depended on setting aside prejudices that had been carefully cultivated by those who profited from division and conflict. Michael guided Jennifer through corridors that branched like arteries through the mountain's heart, past chambers where vampire-human families had created homes that blended the best of both worlds, their children playing games that incorporated supernatural abilities alongside human creativity in ways that suggested evolution was already producing new forms of life that transcended traditional boundaries between mortal and immortal existence. The sanctuary's leader was an ancient vampire named Elizabeth, who had spent 3 centuries building this refuge for those who refused to accept that love between species was impossible. Her pale hands scarred by decades of construction work, and her eyes holding wisdom that came from watching generations of mixed couples find happiness despite forces that seemed determined to destroy any hope of peaceful coexistence. Jennifer felt immediately welcomed into a community that understood her situation without requiring explanations or justifications. Surrounded by women who had faced similar choices and men who had made similar sacrifices in pursuit of relationships that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of love and loyalty and the possibilities that existed when fear was replaced by trust. The sanctuary's medical facilities were more advanced than anything Jennifer had encountered even in Michael's Manor, staffed by healers who specialized in the unique challenges of vampire-human reproduction and hybrid development. Their expertise drawn from centuries of experience with pregnancies that pushed the boundaries of biological possibility in directions that mainstream medicine couldn't acknowledge, without admitting that everything they thought they knew about genetics and evolution was incomplete at best. Dr. Sarah Davis examined Jennifer with equipment that seemed to read cellular changes at the molecular level, while providing commentary that revealed the pregnancy was proceeding faster than even optimistic projections had suggested. The baby's development accelerating in ways that spoke to abilities that were manifesting before birth rather than emerging gradually through childhood, as previous hybrid cases had demonstrated. Jennifer's own transformation was keeping pace with her child's growth, her vampire abilities strengthening daily, while her human characteristics remained intact, in combinations that defied every theory about how supernatural genetics were supposed to function. According to Bloodline, purity advocates on both sides of the species divide. The sanctuary's peace lasted exactly 4 days, before government satellites identified thermal signatures that didn't match known geological patterns in the region, followed by reconnaissance drones that mapped tunnel entrances with precision that spoke to intelligence sources, providing information that should have been impossible for outsiders to obtain. The evacuation began before dawn as electronic warfare specialists attempted to disrupt the government's surveillance capabilities, while families gathered possessions that could be carried quickly through escape routes that led deeper into mountain ranges where civilization had never established permanent footholds and satellite coverage was intermittent at best. Jennifer found herself moving through forest terrain with speed and endurance that amazed her even as her pregnancy entered its 8th month. Her hybrid physiology allowing her to keep pace with vampires whose supernatural abilities had been honed by centuries of practice, while her enhanced senses guided her along paths that seemed to reveal themselves just when navigation became critical. The pursuit that followed demonstrated the government's determination to capture her regardless of collateral damage to innocent families, whose only crime was believing that love could transcend species boundaries. Military vehicles cutting through wilderness areas that were supposed to be protected from development, while aerial units coordinated with ground forces in patterns that spoke to extensive planning and unlimited resources dedicated to what intelligence agencies had classified as a priority operation with implications for national security. Michael's protective instincts had evolved beyond simple possession into something approaching worship as he watched Jennifer navigate challenges that would have defeated most vampires while carrying a child that represented hope for entire species that had been slowly dying from isolation and genetic stagnation. Her ability to function in full sunlight while retaining vampire strength and speed made her invaluable during daylight hours when pure vampires were forced to seek shelter. And her developing psychic abilities allowed her to detect human emotions and intentions from distances that provided early warning about ambushes and surveillance that might otherwise have been undetectable until too late. David Peterson materialized from forest shadows during their third day of flight with information that changed everything about how they understood the forces arrayed against them. His usual hostility replaced by grim determination as he revealed intelligence gathered through contacts in government agencies that most people didn't know existed. The organization hunting Jennifer wasn't interested in simple capture or elimination, he explained, as they took shelter in caves that had been carved by underground rivers flowing toward oceans that had vanished when continents were younger, and the world was still learning what shapes it wanted to hold. Military scientists had achieved partial success in artificial hybrid creation through techniques that violated every ethical principle governing human experimentation. But their laboratory-produced subjects lacked the stability and full power spectrum that natural conception provided, making Jennifer's pregnancy invaluable as a template for perfecting processes that would allow mass production of hybrid soldiers designed for operations against both pure vampires and baseline humans who might resist the new world order being engineered in classified facilities. David's intelligence sources had also revealed the government's ultimate goal, which extended beyond simple military applications toward complete species replacement, eliminating pure vampires and unmodified humans in favor of artificially controlled hybrids who would possess supernatural abilities without the independence and emotional complexity that made natural hybrids difficult to manipulate and control. Jennifer realized that her child represented either the key to this dystopian future or the obstacle that could prevent it, depending on whether the forces of cooperation or domination proved stronger in the conflicts that were already beginning to reshape the hidden world, where supernatural politics intersected with human power structures. The revelation that David Peterson had shifted from enemy to ally based on intelligence that made their personal conflicts irrelevant compared to species-wide extinction created opportunities for cooperation that neither Jennifer nor Michael had anticipated. But it also highlighted how desperate their situation had become when survival required trusting people who had recently been trying to kill them. The alliance that formed around their shared flight from government forces attracted other unlikely partners as word spread through supernatural communication networks that operated below the threshold of human detection. Vampire lords who had spent centuries competing with Michael for territory and influence, suddenly recognizing that their ancient rivalries meant nothing if there were no independent vampires left to continue their bloodlines and political traditions. Lady Sarah arrived at their mountain hideout with information gathered through her extensive network of contacts in human political circles. Her usual elegance unmarred by days of traveling through wilderness that would have challenged experienced outdoorsmen. And her revelation that government agencies had been infiltrating vampire society for decades through carefully placed assets made Jennifer's psychic abilities invaluable for identifying traitors whose deception had been perfected through years of practice. Lord Robert's contribution came in the form of military assets that officially didn't exist, weapons and equipment liberated from government facilities by vampire agents who had been conducting their own intelligence operations, while the nobility focused on internal politics that now seemed trivial compared to external threats that could eliminate their species entirely. The gathering of former enemies in common cause created dynamics that Jennifer found herself uniquely qualified to navigate. Her ability to read emotional truth through physical contact, making her an effective mediator between factions whose mutual suspicion had been earned through centuries of betrayal and competition. Jennifer's pregnancy had progressed to the point where the baby's movements felt like conversations, complex patterns of kicks and shifts that seemed to respond to her emotional state and the supernatural energies flowing around their improvised council meetings. And her developing maternal instincts were being enhanced by psychic abilities that allowed her to sense the child's needs and reactions in ways that felt like direct communication between souls that had been connected since conception. The stress of constant flight and political negotiations began taking a toll that manifested as early labor contractions during a particularly intense strategy session where vampire lords argued about territorial boundaries while government forces closed in on their latest hiding place. The pain cutting through Jennifer's concentration and reminding everyone present that they were racing against biological deadlines as well as military pursuit. Dr. Davis's examination revealed that the contractions were early warning signs rather than immediate labor, but they indicated that the pregnancy was entering a critical phase where stress could trigger premature birth at a time when they lacked access to the specialized facilities that might be necessary if complications arose during delivery of a child whose genetic makeup was unprecedented in recorded supernatural history. Michael's response to this news revealed depths of protective desperation that Jennifer had never seen before. His usual controlled demeanor cracking to reveal fears that went beyond personal loss toward existential terror at the possibility that their child might be born in circumstances that prevented it from surviving long enough to fulfill whatever destiny the prophecies described. The Vampire King, who had commanded respect through 5 centuries of political maneuvering, was reduced to raw emotion by the prospect of losing the 2 beings who had given his immortal existence meaning beyond simple survival and power accumulation. The decision to seek more secure shelter forced them to trust contacts whose loyalty was uncertain, but whose resources might provide the safety necessary for Jennifer to carry the pregnancy to full term without interference from government forces or rival supernatural factions who saw the bridge child as either opportunity or threat, depending on their own political calculations. David Peterson's suggestion that they approach the Covenant of Shadows, an organization of supernatural beings who had remained neutral in vampire politics for centuries, represented their best hope for finding sanctuary that could withstand the kind of assault that government agencies were prepared to launch against targets they considered essential to national security operations. The journey toward the Covenant stronghold would require traveling through territory controlled by supernatural entities whose relationships with vampire society were complex and potentially hostile. But Jennifer's unique status as a pregnant human, carrying vampire royalty while manifesting hybrid abilities herself, made her a figure of sufficient importance that even ancient enemies might be willing to negotiate rather than risk the political consequences of harming someone whose child could reshape the entire supernatural world, depending on how current conflicts resolve themselves. As they prepared for what might be the most dangerous phase of their flight, Jennifer felt the baby respond to her determination with movements that seemed almost encouraging, and she began to understand that her role in the coming changes extended beyond simple survival toward leadership responsibilities she had never sought but couldn't avoid if she wanted to protect not just her own child, but the future of every supernatural being who believed that cooperation was possible between species that had been taught to see each other as natural enemies rather than potential allies in building something better than the world they had inherited from ancestors whose fears had become their children's limitations. The Vampire Council chambers had been carved from a natural cavern system deep beneath the Rocky Mountains, their ancient halls bearing witness to centuries of supernatural politics and power struggles. But tonight, they hosted an emergency gathering that brought together enemies who had spent lifetimes plotting each other's destruction in the face of a threat that made their personal conflicts seem like childish games compared to the existential crisis bearing down on their entire species. Jennifer felt the weight of hundreds of immortal gazes as she entered the main assembly hall, her pregnancy now so advanced that movement required careful balance and frequent rest. but her hybrid abilities had grown strong enough that she could sense the emotional undercurrents flowing between vampire lords who maintained polite facades while calculating advantages they might gain from whatever decisions emerged from this unprecedented summit. The great hall stretched impossibly high above their heads, its ceiling lost in shadows that had swallowed centuries of secrets, while the walls displayed banners representing bloodlines that had survived plagues and wars and the slow transformation of the world from a place where vampires ruled through terror to one where they negotiated for territory through legal frameworks that Jennifer had helped create back when she thought supernatural law was about property disputes rather than species survival. Michael took his place at the council table with authority that 5 centuries of leadership had burned into his very bones. But Jennifer could feel through their bond how her condition affected his ability to focus on political maneuvering, when every instinct he possessed screamed at him to protect her and their unborn child from dangers that seemed to multiply faster than they could be identified and neutralized. Lady Sarah presented intelligence gathered through her network of contacts in human government circles. Her usual elegance, unmarred by the gravity of information that painted a picture of military forces mobilizing for operations that would target every known vampire sanctuary and hybrid community simultaneously. A coordinated strike designed to eliminate supernatural threats to human dominance, while capturing enough specimens for continued experimentation in facilities that existed beyond the reach of any law or oversight agency. Lord Robert's contribution came through gritted teeth as the ancient warrior described military assets that government agencies had deployed in patterns, suggesting they knew exact locations of vampire strongholds that had remained hidden for centuries. Information that could only have come from sources within the supernatural community itself, or surveillance capabilities that rendered traditional concealment methods obsolete. David Peterson stood at the edge of the gathering like a wolf among sheep. His presence tolerated because his intelligence about government operations had proven accurate and valuable. But Jennifer could sense the tension radiating from vampires who had been trained to see hunters as natural enemies, even when circumstances forced temporary cooperation against common threats. The debate that followed revealed fault lines in vampire society that went deeper than simple political disagreement toward fundamental questions about whether their species should fight for independence, seek integration with human society, or accept whatever future government agencies decided to impose through superior firepower and technology. Jennifer found herself drawn into discussions that should have been beyond her authority or expertise. But her unique position as the only pregnant human in vampire council chambers, combined with psychic abilities that allowed her to read emotional truth beneath political rhetoric, made her voice carry weight that transcended traditional hierarchies based on age and bloodline purity. The emergency session was interrupted by alarms that shrieked through communication systems with urgency that made Jennifer's enhanced senses recoil from electromagnetic interference designed to disable supernatural abilities while coordinating human military responses to targets that were moving faster than conventional tracking methods could follow. Detective James Miller's voice echoed through speakers that had been hidden throughout the council chambers, his familiar tone carrying authority that Jennifer remembered from their years working together on cases that had seemed complex at the time, but now felt like simple puzzles compared to the moral labyrinth she found herself navigating. As government forces surrounded the mountain stronghold with weapons designed specifically for supernatural targets, Jennifer felt betrayal cut through her like a physical wound as she heard her former colleague demand surrender of all vampire nobles and immediate transfer of hybrid specimens for scientific study. His words carrying the weight of ultimatums that left no room for negotiation or compromise, despite years of collaboration that had built trust between their communities. The assault began with electromagnetic pulses that disrupted vampire senses and communication systems, while military units equipped with silver ammunition and UV floodlights established perimeters designed to prevent escape through traditional supernatural means. But the attackers had underestimated how quickly their targets could adapt when survival demanded innovation rather than reliance on abilities that had served them well for centuries. Jennifer discovered that her hybrid nature made her immune to many of the technological countermeasures deployed against pure vampires. Her enhanced strength and speed functioning normally, while ancient lords struggled with sensory disruption that left them vulnerable to weapons they would normally dodge with contemptuous ease. The battle that erupted in the council chambers revealed the true scope of preparation that government forces had invested in this operation. Soldiers moving with coordination that spoke to months of training specifically for combat against supernatural opponents. While their equipment demonstrated understanding of vampire weaknesses that could only have come from extensive study of captured subjects, Jennifer found herself at the center of fighting that raged between beings whose conflicts had shaped hidden history for millennia. Her psychic abilities allowing her to coordinate defensive efforts by reading hostile intentions before they could be acted upon. While her pregnancy made her simultaneously the most valuable and most vulnerable person in chambers, where immortal warriors traded blows that could shatter stone and bend steel. Michael fought with desperation that transformed his usual controlled elegance into something approaching feral fury. His protective instincts amplified by the blood bond until every threat to Jennifer felt like a personal attack that demanded immediate and overwhelming response. But even his centuries of combat experience couldn't overcome the simple mathematics of being outnumbered by enemies who had prepared specifically for this confrontation. The realization that conventional resistance was doomed came to Jennifer through a combination of tactical analysis and psychic intuition that painted pictures of defeat spreading through the supernatural community like wildfire. Government forces systematically eliminating resistance while capturing enough specimens to perfect artificial hybrid creation that would make natural reproduction unnecessary for their purposes. Jennifer felt the blood moon prophecy calling to her, like destiny made manifest, the ancient words resonating through her consciousness with power that seemed to flow directly from the child she carried. And she understood with crystalline clarity that fulfilling the prophecy's requirements was the only path that led to survival for everyone she had come to love and protect. The choice the prophecy demanded felt like standing at the edge of an abyss where jumping might save the world, but would certainly destroy her individual existence, transforming her life force into power that could break the curse, preventing vampire reproduction while simultaneously ending her ability to participate in the future she was trying to create. Michael's reaction to her decision revealed depths of emotion that 5 centuries of careful control had barely contained. His refusal to accept her sacrifice, creating their first real conflict as lovers, who had faced every external threat as partners, discovered that some choices could drive wedges between them that no amount of love could bridge without fundamental compromise from both sides. Their argument raged, even as battle continued around them. Jennifer insisting that the prophecy offered the only solution that could save both species, while Michael demanded alternatives that didn't require her death as payment for everyone else's survival. His desperation bleeding through their bond with intensity that left her emotionally raw from experiencing his pain alongside her own fear and determination. The moment when Jennifer's labor began felt like the universe demanding resolution to conflicts that had been building toward this convergence of prophecy and politics, biology and magic, love and duty intertwining in ways that made individual desires seem insignificant compared to forces that would reshape reality itself, depending on choices made in the next few hours. Doctor, Jennifer appeared through combat that should have been impossible to navigate. Her medical training adapted to battlefield conditions as she helped Mary find relative safety in an alcove where ancient stone might prove.